Well, welcome to the green room here at the Koger Center for the Arts, where we give most of our concerts during the year. And we're here to welcome you to our second Masterworks concert of the season, which is entitled Rachmaninoff 150. It's because we are celebrating this year, in year 2023, marks the 150th anniversary of Sergei Rachmaninoff's birth. So he was born in 1873. Of course, the well-known Russian composer, pianist. Many of his piano works, solo piano pieces, many of you are probably familiar with at least probably the second piano concerto, the third piano concerto, which has sort of its reputation for being notoriously difficult for the piano soloist, and perhaps Rhapsody on a theme by Paganini, or maybe one of the symphonies, probably the second symphony, which is probably his most performed symphony. And if you look out there, you can find many recordings of Rachmaninoff performing as a pianist. He actually left Russia right after when the Russian Revolution happened in 1917. He spent some time in Sweden, Denmark, all over the place, eventually settled in the US. And so when he died in 1943, he had just built a new house or bought a new house in Beverly Hills. So he spent a lot of time also concertizing around the world as a pianist. So the Rachmaninoff is probably a name that many of you are familiar with. On this concert, though, we're sort of featuring sort of a different side of Rachmaninoff a little bit. So you will hear, in the second half of the program, you will hear his Symphony No. 3, which is sort of a later work. It comes from mid-1930s. It's the last symphony he wrote. He wrote 3 symphonies, and then plus symphonic dances, which is sort of his final masterpiece that he wrote shortly before his death. And then we're also featuring the 4th piano concerto. So he wrote 4 piano concertos plus the Rhapsody on a theme by Paganini. So sort of 5 major works for piano and orchestra. And so we're featuring the 4th piano concerto in the first half, which also has sort of a very interesting background story to it. And I think all of the things that we're going to talk about with these pieces kind of bring to light sort of aspect of Rachmaninoff and several of his colleagues as well, who had to sort of live a life of exile during those decades of the 20th century, who had to leave their homeland, had to settle, make life for themselves, new lives for themselves in new home, but still having this pull or tug of being plagued by homesickness, missing the language of back home or the food or the people, what have you, but trying to deal with sort of the new reality of life where they have to spend time in exile. And Rachmaninoff is sort of in a way sort of a classic example of that struggle. And you can see and hear sort of that element of an artist in exile, especially in these 2 pieces that you're going to hear this evening. So as I mentioned, so Rachmaninoff, he had already established himself both as a composer and pianist before the revolution. So and a lot of the pieces, for instance, the second piano concerto, let's say, probably the most famous piano concerto or most popular piano concerto by Rachmaninoff. The second piano concerto, that was written like in 1902. So many years before he had to leave Russia. The second symphony, which is just very sort of hyper-romantic, it's gorgeous, but it's also very long. It's like an hour-long symphony, to the point where until recently, until the last few decades or so, people used to put a lot of big cuts into this hour-long symphony, for whatever reason. And now we tend to perform, the second symphony. It's in like uncut in sort of sort of the director's cut of the Second Symphony, but that used to be the case. So before he left Russia, and you could see this in the Second Concerto, Piano Concerto, Third Piano Concerto, Second Symphony, sort of his earlier hits as a composer is this his ability, of course, to sort of just to spin off these memorable, gorgeous melodies that seem to just go on, and it's just this sense of timelessness that's involved, and then as a result, these pieces tend to kind of be expansive, both in its feeling, the way that it makes us, the performers, and you, the listeners, feel, and literally in duration as well. After he left Russia, he sort of went through sort of a shifting his thinking a little bit. He tried to be more economical in his writing. He wanted to be more concise. So there are a few pieces, for instance, the first piano concerto, which comes from the late 1800s, so in his 20s, he made some extensive revisions to that piece. The fourth piano concerto, which you're going to hear, it's most often performed in its sort of final version of the piece, which he didn't really settle on it until 1941. It has its origins many years before, actually even before he left Russia. So we think that he started working on this concerto as early as like 1914. And as a matter of fact, the section of one of the movements quotes this music that he had written, intended to be another piece for solo piano, just for solo piano. As early as like 1911, he comes back and recycles that piece. He initially got this piece premiered in 1928 with Leopold Stokowski of the Fantasia fame, Stokowski conducting the Philadelphia Orchestra, and Rachmaninoff himself playing the solo part. And it has such a bad review from that performance, because the critics thought it just sort of was random, and people thought it was a bit chaotic in a way, and there were too many ideas sort of crammed into this concerto, and people kind of missed this very easily singable, recognizable melodies, that big tunes, so to speak, big tunes that he was known for from his earlier period. So the critics just kind of didn't really like it. So then Rachmaninoff decided, and apparently he was horrified, because when he got back the initial printing of the score, he said it ran up to 110 pages, and he was like, that is too long. So he decided he needed to revise this. So over the course of the next 12, 13 years, he kept on sort of revising this concerto until he made this final version in 1941, in which he kept on just kind of making it shorter. So he decided, okay, so this chunk of music, we don't need this, it needs to go. So it's like quite a sort of heavy editing process, and just kind of chopping things up and cutting things shorter until he was happy with the final result. And so that's the final version, like a third version of this concerto, which you will hear that dates from 1941. Having said that, though, it still has, in its three movements, there are still gorgeous, it's just incredibly gorgeous melodies are sort of placed throughout this concerto. The middle movement, the slow movement of this concerto starts just with the piano, just very tender, very introspective, and then strings answer with this almost kind of bluesy, not bluesy, but almost you could kind of tell that Rachmaninoff had listened to some 1920s jazz in New York and wanted to sort of create that experience, recreate or capture that experience in this concerto as well. So it's like a little smoky, little hazy, very introspective, intimate kind of feeling that he evokes in the middle movement. In the first movement, he opens with this idea. There's almost always a conflict, not a conflict, but it's almost this dichotomy between the melody that ascends, like, so it starts low and goes up, and then the descending melody, and it sort of becomes sort of fight between the two ideas. And it's almost like, again, you can kind of see some of the turmoil that maybe he was feeling as an artist, as a composer, trying to break away from his initial success, which he felt by the late 20s he was definitely feeling was outdated. So he's trying to sort of forge new ground, but he's kind of in this sort of experimental mood and trying to decide what works well. And that, you can see that in this long revision process, as well. Initially, we were going to be performing a piece that comes sort of after he left Russia, probably the most popular, enduring piece of music that he wrote after he left Russia in 1917. It dates from 1934, and that's the Rhapsody on a Theme by Paganini. Sometimes it's just referred to as Paganini Rhapsody. And that was the piece that we were initially scheduled to perform on this program, and featuring the 2022 Arthur Fraser International Piano Competition winner, Catherine Liu, who was scheduled to play that piece. But she's, due to unforeseen circumstances, we are now going to have Catherine come to Colombia next season, so in 24-25 season, and play the Rachmaninoff Paganini Rhapsody with us then. So we were basically left with a choice. So what do we do? And we wanted to keep the Rachmaninoff 150 theme. So we decided, then we look for different pianists and so on. So there's a rising young pianist who was in the most recent, competed in the most recent edition of the Van Cliburn competition last year. Albert Cano Smit is the pianist who is now coming to play the fourth piano concerto. If you go on the YouTube, I think you can actually see his performance of this piece from this past spring with the Seattle Symphony. And he does an amazing job with this concerto. So I'm looking forward to introducing Albert to you and introducing this particular Rachmaninoff concerto, which might not be familiar to several of you out there. Even the folks who have heard or listened to the second piano concerto, third piano concerto, and so on. Probably the fourth piano concerto is a new experience. You can still see all of the signature moves in a way by Rachmaninoff, but again, it is a little bit different. The big tunes, he doesn't stay with the big tunes for a long time as he does in his earlier pieces. So you almost kind of you have to be you might not be ready for it sometimes. Sometimes all of a sudden these big tunes will appear and you're like, oh, this is great. And then you'll just move on, instead of kind of building that into like a huge thing. Rachmaninoff by this time, he didn't want to do that. So, it's kind of a different aesthetic where it's more based sort of in this idea of concise, economical style of composition that Rachmaninoff was trying to achieve here. What's interesting is that when he left Russia, he was probably more active as a composer before he left Russia, and the sad story is they literally left. His family had to leave their home in Russia. Just with the suitcases. So he grabbed whatever manuscripts that he had and he wanted to grab. A lot of the other things were left back home. They had to basically leave many things behind. Actually, his house burned down shortly after that. So he basically lost everything. And so what he decided, and so this is the whole like 7-year period after leaving Russia, where he basically almost exclusively performed as a piano soloist instead of composing. He felt like he needed to recoup some of the money that he has saved up back home. And in order to do that, he wanted to get the engagement fee performing his own music in recitals or with orchestras performing one of his existing concertos. So he had to sort of leave composition behind a little bit, even though that's what he really wanted to do. And that happened for many years. And then in the mid 30s, also in late 20s, he did this concerto. And then also in the mid 30s, he had another sort of period in which he wanted to refocus on composition. So that's where the Paganini Rhapsody comes. And also the Second Symphony, the Third Symphony rather, the Third Symphony, which we are performing, that dates from 1936, comes. Again, the orchestra that did the premiere of this symphony was the Philadelphia Orchestra. So you can still find recordings, and I think they have been reissued in various formats, of Rachmaninoff performing his own music with the Philadelphia Orchestra. So this was the orchestra that he had developed the closest relationship with, as a composer, as a performer. So he received a lot of commissions. A lot of the premieres happened in Philadelphia, including also the Third Symphony. So imagine this, back in the day, back in the 30s. So the Paganini Rhapsody was a huge hit, and as I mentioned, sort of the only huge hit that he enjoyed as a composer after leaving Russia. So that was 2 years before the composition or premiere of this symphony. So you can imagine, coming on the heels of that success, the expectations were rather high for the audience, for the critics, and so on. And they felt that the Third Symphony just wasn't as accessible to them. They felt maybe it was too, and of course, a lot of the people were expecting something like this famous Second Symphony, which comes from many decades before. Many years before the composition of this latest one, but people were expecting these very easy to remember melodies, this sort of uber romantic, piece of music, and that's not what they got in this symphony, or that's what they felt like they were cheated out of that expectation. So it did not receive a good critical success. Rachmaninoff's famous story from early on in his career was that his first symphony from like 1890 something was a complete flop, apparently. And he had already established, he was considered a rising composer, and this was a huge blow to his reputation. And then he went into this sort of 2 years of writer's block and depression. And what brought him out of it was hypnosis therapy. And that brought him out of that funk. And then he wrote the Second Piano Concerto, which was a huge success. After the Third Symphony, he went into sort of a similar writer's block period for a few years because he was sort of, devastated by the critics who did not like this new symphony. He once quipped that, had a quote about this particular symphony, which went something like, it has, this symphony, he said, the Third Symphony has been played in most of the major cities around the world once. And he said, in every city, nobody liked it. Then he said, give it about 50 years. He said, but I would suspect in 50 years, those people, people then will appreciate or have a new, different sense of appreciation and love for this symphony. And in a way, he was right, because now, the last few decades or so, you're starting to see a lot more performances of the Third Symphony. More so is the case with the symphonic dances, which is a piece I feel like I've done several more times than this particular symphony. Even the First Symphony, which was sort of the piece that sent him into the first writer's block from many years ago, even that piece is starting to be performed by orchestras around the world too. So it's the Third Symphony is it's amazing because it's you can tell how intimately he knew who he was writing this for. So the Philadelphia Orchestra and what the Philadelphia Orchestra was capable of in the late 30s. It is a very technically challenging piece, very colorful for the entire orchestra. It's in 3 movements instead of 4 movements. And he kind of like doing this thing where the second movement is in really 2 parts. So instead of just having a slow movement, it has sort of this sort of slow, fast, which kind of acts like a scherzo movement, and then returns to the slow movement. So you get sort of 2 movements in one in that second movement. But that second movement features, some of the most gorgeous writing that Rachmaninoff wrote in his entire output, as well as some of the most exciting and brilliant, almost wild rhythmic adventure for the entire orchestra in that middle section, the scherzo portion of that movement. So, it's a symphony that sort of is a hidden gem, and we did this piece maybe 12, 13 years ago, one of my first years, I think, here. And it's always a fun piece to perform and to share with our audiences. So we're very much looking forward to that, to those 2 pieces by Rachmaninoff. And then to open this concert, we're highlighting a piece. The English title or English translation of the title is kind of goes with this sort of melancholy image of Rachmaninoff, the artist, and it's called Of a Sad Evening. And it's one of the few pieces that was written by French composer Lydie Boulanger. And Boulanger was considered a prodigy, but she has several illnesses when she was very young that sort of affected her immune system throughout her life. So she died, I think, at the age of 24. She had an older sister, Lily Boulanger had an older sister, Nadia Boulanger, who is probably, if not the most famous, one of the most famous composition teachers of all time, who taught in Paris and then was invited around the world to teach many generations of composers. You were sort of who's who, not only composers, but musicians of the 20th century. The chances are they had some interactions with Nadia Boulanger, either as a student, like Aaron Copland was Nadia Boulanger's pupil, or even like somebody like Burt Bacharach, who I think took like a workshop or something led by Lydie Boulanger's older sister, Nadia. So Lydie Boulanger was recognized as a very much a prodigy. She was the first female composer to win the coveted Prix de Rome, or the Rome Prize, which is sort of the huge compositional prize that's always was sort of an honor for any French composer to try to win Prix de Rome. And Lydie Boulanger was the very first composer to win that. The piece that we're going to open with, again, she uses a huge orchestra. It's almost sometimes you hear there are 2 pieces that Lydie Boulanger wrote towards the end of her short life. This one, Of a Sad Evening, and then there's another one called Of a Spring Morning. And so that one is sort of a companion piece. It's a lot shorter. It's a very cheerful, colorful piece of music. So she almost intended these to be a pair, like a sort of pair of pieces that could be performed together. On this one, we're doing the Of a Sad Evening is the piece we are doing, and she had this knack for writing beautiful melodies. You can hear some influences of Debussy and sort of Debussy and Ravel, their sound world a little bit. So you might think part of it is a little bit impressionistic in the way that Boulanger kind of treats the instrumental colors in the orchestra. But what sets this piece apart though is like how powerful the brass, the sort of the power of the brass instruments that the Lily Boulanger sort of draws out at the big climactic moments of this piece that contrasts with sort of the opening and closing sections, which are very tender, in a way, very like effuse, like effusive and this very fragrant kind of writing. But then there's this very powerful moment throughout the piece as well. So looking forward to sharing this piece as well. It's a fairly dramatic concert throughout the evening, anchored by two pieces by Sergei Rachmaninoff, and I hope you can join us for the second Masterworks of the season, the Rachmaninoff 150.